Maybe you've noticed that all the coolest looking gear belongs to tanks, or that tanks can easily solo a lot of past content, but maybe you're nervous to start tanking because you think that it has some sort of leadership responsibility. While you do head the charge, you only have one job as a tank. Be a masochist. You want to get pummeled by every enemy on screen. You know that none of those other wimpy roles can take a hit, so you make sure all the attention is on you. As a tank, you naturally have a 20% damage reduction on top of high defense gear and mitigation abilities. Luckily, keeping aggression is really easy to do. So long as your tank stance is on, every time you hit an enemy, you generate 10 times the aggro, and enemies target whoever has the most aggro. If you keep hitting enemies, it'll be almost impossible to lose their aggro. Looking at you, Pictomancer. Now, there's a little more to tanking than that, which is why I'm showing you how to tank from ground zero. I'm going to assume you're the most nervous and unprepared tank in the history of MMOs, so that no matter where you fall on the confidence scale, you know that you can tank. It's important to note that the best tank to start learning is any. Literally any tank is fine, because they're all roughly the same at low levels, and low levels is where we're going to start. Dungeon tanking revolves around 3 simple things, whether at level 15 or level 100. Pulling packs, using mitigation, and using the right combat rotation. You should definitely have completed your level 15 quest if you're a gladiator or marauder. This grants you a ranged attack. By using this, you can get enemies' attention as early as possible. This ability also has an added benefit of increased enmity generation, meaning the enemies hit are far less likely to go after your teammates, who will be hitting the enemies as you all run. Let's talk about enmity for a second. You can tell if you're the one the enemy is targeting by looking at your enmity list. A blue-green circle means you're a pesky insect at best. Yellow triangle, you didn't like their favorite band. Orange triangle, you've disagreed with their politics. Red square, die, die, die! When you're playing solo, you'll always have aggro. But when you're in a party, you need to look at this gauge to make sure all the icons next to enemy names are red. Often it's as simple as a single ranged or AoE attack, or using provoke between abilities. This list doesn't have any way of telling you when you're about to lose aggro, so keep an eye on it for changes. For the enemy you have targeted, however, aggro is shown broken down by who has how much. An A for aggro means you're in the top spot. Then it goes in order like finishing a race, second place, third place, etc. Again, tank stance allows you to generate so much enmity that as long as you get one hit on an enemy, you should hold its attention for a long time. Since we have to be level 15 to get our ranged attack and unlock dungeons, we may as well run the Hall of the Novice trainings to get ourselves a nice set of armor. It also comes with a fantastic brand new ring. Just keep in mind the trainings are pretty lacking. If you already have similar dungeon gear, you could skip the trainings as the gear stats are the same, but I do recommend getting the brand new ring if you haven't yet, for great stats and an experience boost. With our ranged attack and gear ready to go, let's first practice by finding an area with a lot of enemies around our level. Simply run around and ranged attack as many as you can. Notice how they get added to the enmity list as they're pulled, and get to know that red square. And notice that you don't really get hit while running. That'll hold true in the early dungeons too. Once you have something like 8 enemies, I want you to stand in place and let them hit you. It's okay if you die even. Dying has very little consequence, so learn not to fear it. I want you to pay attention to how fast the enemies damage you. You might be surprised just how slowly you get hurt. Now consider that dungeon enemies are about 3 times as strong as a regular mob. If you pulled 8 or 9 enemies, you'd have the equivalent of a single group of enemies in a dungeon. Most dungeons are designed to have 2 groups between bosses. Doubling the damage you're taking now is a great indicator of an actual pull. And given that you have a healer watching out for you, surviving is way easier than you might have thought. Now I'm going to pull 12 enemies using ranged attacks and AoEs. Then I'll use our first mitigation ability, Rampart. This ability reduces incoming damage by 20% for 20 seconds. Using it on 2 packs of enemies will save so much damage. And using both this and your offensive buff will save so much time in dungeons. This reduction is in addition to your natural 20% damage reduction just for being a tank. So long as you're geared and mitigating, you're a brick wall. You might wonder, shouldn't I save my best moves for the boss? And the easy answer is no. All these enemies add up to be much stronger than a single boss. While there are moves like tank busters, they shouldn't kill you, and the healer has plenty of time to heal you afterward. Since the goal is to mitigate as much damage as possible, remember these few tips. Don't use Rampart until you're done pulling. Using it while you run is a waste, especially in the early dungeons where the chasers won't hit you anyway. If the enemies are basically dead when the mitigation comes off cooldown, don't bother using it. Some mitigations reduce damage to the entire party. You can use them as backup abilities for trash bowls, but they're generally more effective on bosses' room-wide attacks. For example, Reprisal will only reduce 25% of the amount of damage that Rampart will over its lifetime during a pull, but 4 people will get a 10% reduction during a room-wide attack. You can start on any dungeon, as the principles are the same, but for the sake of ease, let's enter Sastasha. You might know that Sastasha has a long stretch in which you can pull a lot of enemies. It absolutely does, and you need to see 2 things. A, enemies will get hurt and sometimes even die as you run, especially if you keep ranged attacking as you go. Half-dead enemies can't hurt you for very long when you stop. B, any healer who sees a lot of enemies is going to know you're going to take a lot of damage. As you can see from my first pull, the healer was jumping to show me that I could still carry on. You are not as flimsy as you might think. To prove it, I made sure to pull every single enemy going forward. And this, mind you, was a duty finder party, not one that I knew. Just ask yourself, am I grabbing more than 2 enemies? I'll stand in the center and use 1 AoE, then continue. I can use a ranged attack first if I'm far away. Is there just 1 or 2? Then I'll use ranged attacks to pick them up and continue. In either case, continue to attack enemies as you run, because why not deal more damage? If an enemy gets out of range or sight, you can often switch to another one and keep attacking. When I've reached the end of the pull, what do? I make sure I've passed the last group to let the enemies bunch together, and I stand still, facing the enemies away from the party to avoid letting them get hit by telegraphed attacks. I use my strongest available mitigation, and almost always just 1 at a time so I don't waste their effectiveness or have nothing left for the next group. When the enemies are bunched and I've mitigated, I use my offensive buff and keep using my AoE until only 2 enemies remain. Then I switch to single target for better damage. That's it. Pull enemies, mitigate damage, deal damage, repeat. For bosses, it's exactly the same. Use defensive abilities as they cool down to make things easier, or if you know when a big hit is coming, and that's not something you'll learn until you have experience. Don't worry about trying to align mitigations to certain attacks on your first run, silly. Just be a masochist. Let's also talk about why we face enemies and bosses away from the group, and why we stand still. Enemies attack what's in front of them. Sometimes this hits multiple people. Sometimes there's no telegraph for these attacks. Just like that. But that's not all. Numerous melee abilities get stronger when you hit from certain angles, like the flank or rear. If your melees have to move a lot, they might not get that bonus, slowing your team down for no reason. Which also means you take more damage, which also means your healer has to heal more. Pick one spot and stay there, otherwise you'll cause unnecessary inefficiency. And if you're spinning the boss around because you think it looks so cool, then you're failing to account for both of those things. Just don't do it, fella. Look, you don't need to have every point of vitality maxed out. You don't even need to have gotten your second mitigation, Reprisal, yet. I've given you evidence that a decently geared tank can survive any low-level content even when pulling hard. I've had you practice beforehand. Now, there are occasionally some other things to consider with tanking, such as what to do when there are 2 tanks. That will be covered in other videos, because for now, you don't have to worry about that. You don't have heaping responsibilities, you don't have to stun every attack. Just pull, mitigate, and face enemies away from the party. You just need the confidence to try, and now you have it. Once you see that it's both easy and exhilarating, you'll find your bloodlust. You're ready. Now go get pummeled, and love it.